Hello, everyone. Welcome to Chapter 11. Chapter 11 deals with advertising, and there's lots of information in this chapter that hopefully will assist our understanding of persuasion and persuasive principles in the modern era. So let's get started. Advertising is everywhere. We see advertisements on the television, in films. We see advertisements on the web. We see advertisements on our cell phones. We see advertisements on the side of buses or benches waiting for buses. We see advertisements on the subway. We see advertisements on billboards. We see advertisements even on some types of food or milk carton packages, okay? Advertising is really a part of the modern experience. It is definitely something that defines the mass media, and it's something that's very important for us to pay attention to as students of persuasion. Now, it's interesting to note, before we get into specific different types of advertising principles, that one specific ad, one 30-second Super Bowl ad, goes for about $2.5 million. So think about that, and then think about how much money is spent by consumers who purchase products that allow advertising companies to continue to make commercials to promote corporations and the various products or interests that they are supporting. So we can ask ourselves, are we branded? Like a rock. Just do it. Do the do. What's up? And of course, the real thing. Now, if you don't know which companies are branded with these different phrases, then you can, of course, look up the answers to that at the bottom of page 1 for Chapter 11. However, I'm fairly confident that most of us do know what these different brand phrases are, or in the case of Nike and other types of companies such as Coca-Cola or even the iPods or different types of music devices have been branded simply by a symbol, right? So with Nike, you don't even have to have a phrase anymore. You just simply see the swoosh symbol and you know that you're looking at a Nike thing. Now, what's even more interesting about advertising companies is that in many cases, they've actually gotten consumers like ourselves to buy into their companies to the extent that we actually do advertising for them on a daily basis, right? Some of you probably know where I'm going with this. How many of you have a hat or a hoodie or a pair of shoes or jeans or a t-shirt that actually has a brand logo or brand symbol for many of these companies or other companies that are more likely to make clothing, right? So capitalism and the proliferation of a market-based economy are the primary motivations and ideas that underpin the advertising industry in the United States and across the world. And so we're going to talk about a lot of these issues in this lecture today, and hopefully we'll find something that's useful both for ourselves and, of course, for the people that we end up having in our lives, that hopefully we can influence in a positive way to provide education and media literacy so that we can control the effect of advertising on both our own awareness and thoughts and desires, right, and wants, but also potentially for those of you who are thinking of having children. Media literacy is a really important part of controlling the potential unanticipated or undesirable effects of advertising in a modern society. So let's get started, and hopefully we'll all learn something important and relevant. So advertisements in society are everywhere. We've already established this fact. And generally speaking, the ads are seeking to sell something that is tangible, right? So typically, advertisements are seeking to sell goods or products, but ads are not just selling something tangible, they're also associating something intangible with a tangible item, right? This is one of the reasons why capitalism and advertising is so effective. So, for example, if you see a Coca-Cola advertisement and you see people that look like yourself having a really good time, enjoying something really fun outside, like a ball game with their friends and their family, and getting together for a very all-American afternoon, and they're enjoying bottles of Coca-Cola or cans of Coca-Cola, right? they are not simply just selling the soda, but they're actually selling the experience that the ad is claiming that the soda will help to promote, right? And so that's how advertisements often are not just selling tangible products, but they are also selling experiences or things that are more intangible. So when we look at intangible ideas or intangible associations, we're looking at experiences, ideologies, desires that in many ways take place in an imaginary world, right? Now, some of us may actually feel connected with our family when we're drinking Coca-Cola, and we might feel connected with our friends. And sure, Coca-Cola really gives you that caffeine and sugar burst that's going to help you, run a home run if you're playing a ball game with your friends and things like that. But the association that is often conveyed with ads in society, sure, there is a product that is being highlighted, but those ads are only effective because they're connecting those products with an intangible experience or a desire, a very human desire, which most people would seek to achieve or experience, right? So in some ways, the intangible that is represented in advertisements are idealized versions of reality, abnormal, social or physical versions of reality that are very difficult to achieve on some level, which is why ads are so effective and which is why people spend their money buying products and services and goods because they have been convinced to have an association of something positive with that product, which they hope, at least on an unconscious level, they hope they will also be able to achieve. So advertisements in society are not just selling tangible goods, but the reason they are so successful in promoting a capitalist system is because they are selling an experience. And it's very important to be able to identify that theoretically, both in terms of understanding the idea of advertisements, but also in terms of applying it to our daily lives, in terms of how we are influenced potentially by advertisements. Advertisements are based on the power of association and the ability of the advertisement to establish an association between a product or a good and a experience or an emotion or some kind of a relational human outcome. So as I stated before, typically advertisements and products tend to highlight or showcase a certain type of a good, and this good is surrounded by positive feelings, people who are having a good time, they're feeling successful, they're feeling accomplished, they're having positive interactions with the people that they care about. Oftentimes, advertisements highlight a story in a short 30 or 60-second clip, and the story takes place sometimes completely non-verbally without people even speaking. Other times, there are some types of speech happening. Typically, there is an emotional draw that takes place so that we're able to affiliate or identify with the people in the story. And most of the time, ads tend to draw on people to tell their stories. More recently, we've seen a lot of ads who have used animals as a way of getting that sort of cute and cuddly effect established. But even when there is an ad that tends to rely primarily on animals or other types of creatures, there also usually tends to be a person involved in the ad to work on creating that effect or that connection with human beings. Oftentimes, the experience that's being sold with the product is actually peripheral or not really related to the actual purchase that a person is about to make, but because of the power of association, then people affiliate that product with that potential experience, and if the ad has been received effectively and it has been delivered with regularity during the right types of viewing times and people have been exposed to the ad enough, then that advertisement will typically motivate people to choose one product over others that are similar in many ways. So typically also the product and the company are endorsing a certain type of an ideology, a certain type of identity, or a branding, if you will, right? And in this way, we see that advertising takes place both on a micro level in terms of the individual and what the individual thinks and believes and eventually ends up doing in terms of behavior, right? But we also see how advertising works on a macro level which basically refers to the way in which advertisements promote the capitalist machine and sells goods and services to mass populations. So subliminal ads are advertisements that are transmitted typically in a split second, a millisecond, and so individuals are not conscious of the fact that these ads are even being played before their eyes. So oftentimes it'll be a picture or maybe a word or maybe a sound, and because it is flashed for such a quick second, then the average person is not even aware of it, right? But with the advent of recording technology, nowadays it's much more possible that people can discover later on that a film or a television show is flashing subliminal ads. But the real question is, do they work? Well, the research has found that subliminally transmitted messages do not actually influence consumer attitudes or behavior. So although they have been found not to work, this is probably, by the way, the reason why advertising companies do not tend to invest in subliminal ads, as well as the fact that there is a big ethical issue. And so with the advent of recording technology, consumers can easily discover and document the fact that subliminal ads are taking place, which of course can end up negatively influencing the credibility and ethic perception of a company, right? So in that sense, it's maybe more work than it's worth. But I encourage you to watch this clip at the end of this slide here, and it'll give you an example of a few different types of subliminal advertisements that took place. I think the clip is a little outdated. I think it's 5-10 years old, but it was during a awards ceremony that took place on Australian television, and it was done by the Toyota Yaris, by KFC, and also by Oil of Olay. And so these ads that you will see, because they do slow down the play enough so you can actually notice them. If you had watched the actual show with a regular, just in real time, you wouldn't even see them. But if you're able to pay absolute attention to the television and potentially record it, then this is something that you're able to become more aware of. So check out this link at the bottom of this clip, and it'll give you an example of what subliminal ads can look like. And again, dealing with the issue of subliminal ads, the real question in our minds as students of persuasion and as people who want to understand advertising better is, do they work? Well, generally speaking, the research has found no, they don't work. People have different awareness thresholds for being consciously aware of stimuli. And so in order to actually influence a mass audience, a subliminal message would really have to be so discreetly beamed that the people who have normal thresholds of awareness wouldn't catch it, right? And some people actually may be aware of it, and that, of course, can decrease the credibility of the consumer perception. The second reason that they don't tend to work is that there's really no guarantee that consumers will interpret or see the message in the way that the advertisers hoped. So this, of course, could actually lead to the opposite impact on consumers rather than the intended impact. A third reason why these types of ads don't tend to work is that for a subliminal message actually to influence attitudes, it must really, at the very least, be viewed by someone who is giving the ad their absolute complete attention, right? So let's say you bring people into a laboratory and you want to see, okay, do these ads work? Chances are it's possible there could be an effect if you have people that are just sitting there and doing nothing else but staring at the screen. But in reality, when we are watching television or a movie or whatever else we might be consuming in terms of the media, we're also doing other things, right? Most of us have people around us and we're talking to them, or we're playing with our cat while we're watching TV, or we're eating our popcorn when we're at the movies, or we're doing other things. We're not just staring at the screen consistently. And so because of that, the chances that they actually work are also minimized, okay? And the other thing is that the ad that flashes the subliminal message is in the ad, right? It doesn't mean that that advertisement is actually, going to get in the consumer's head. And so although the ad may have flashed across the screen, really if the person isn't even aware of it, then that image is soon to be replaced by some other image or some other ad or some other person that comes on the screen later, right? So there are many reasons why subliminal ads have not been found to be effective. Not to mention, there are clearly some business and social ethic issues because, as I stated before, when consumers discover the fact that a company is using subliminal advertisements, it opens the corporation up to a whole host of criticisms by media watch organizations, but also by consumers, right? And ultimately, the customer is always right. And if your customer doesn't appreciate subliminal advertising, then they're not going to purchase your product, right? So it tends to behoove the corporations more to endorse advertisements that are more direct. And of course, product placement is another major form of advertising in the modern era, and we're going to talk about that next. Now, product placement is a much more common advertising strategy, especially in the modern era. And many of you grew up having product placement be a very regular part of your viewing experience as consumers, whether it's viewing television or films or nowadays even video games. And so basically what product placement is it's the strategic placement of certain types of products. Typically they're everyday products that we tend to use. And so it might be like a certain soda brand or a certain type of a Kleenex box, or maybe a certain type of a computer or a cell phone company or something like that. And they strategically place certain products in movies, television shows, and as I said, video games. This is fairly routine. It tends to be a part of the viewing experience in the modern era, and all of us have seen product placement before, right? The thing about it is that we don't actually tend to notice the product placement very much, at least not as much as regular advertisements, because the products are placed in the background, right? And of course, when we're viewing television or film, the foreground of what we're paying attention to are the stories that are taking place between individuals who are in the film or in the show, right? So for this reason, they don't tend to be noticed as much by consumers. However, they do also exist, right? They are in the actual clips or in the scenes. And so what they tend to find with product placement is that if you can weave in the products that are being used by the characters who have a central role to play in the story, then those kinds of product placement situations tend to be more common. So in terms of payments for the ad industries, typically the company who has a product that's placed in a given show will often pay money or work out different types of exchanges for endorsements and things like that to the company who's endorsing the actual television show, right? So let's take the show Friends, right? Most people have watched Friends. It's on syndication now. You can flip through any kind of, regular TV station on any given day, and you can see syndicated shows of Friends taking place. You can also watch Friends on Netflix. And in the show Friends, you do see a lot of different product placements, right? And so let's say that we have Ross and Rachel, and they're having a big conversation about their relationship. And in that scene, you see Rachel reaching for a Kleenex, and you see the Kleenex box right there. According to product placement theory and expectations, being able to link the product in a central way to the main character's storyline will make it more effective, okay? And obviously, the Kleenex Corporation has probably been working behind the scenes with the Friends writers because, of course, in order to have the product be in the show, you have to have a writer that will, put it in the show, right? And so it's, this is something that is a collaborative effort behind the scenes by companies that are selling products and the companies that are actually putting out television or film products, right? So it's good to be aware of it. Do they influence mass audience attitudes, beliefs, and actions? Probably to a certain level, right? And I think it's just something that all of us can start to pay more attention to when we watch our favorite shows or our favorite movies. And we can ask ourselves, okay, is this the product that I tend to buy over the other ones? Like, do I tend to prefer Kleenex products over, the generic Kleenex boxes? And why is that, right? So does the strategic placement of certain products in different shows that I tend to watch a lot of have anything to do with the choices that I'm making in my daily purchasing decisions? This is definitely something worth considering for all of us. So product placement did not take place forever in the past, all right? Product placement first began with the E.T. movie, with Steven Spielberg's E.T. film, and Reese's Candies, right? And if you folks have seen that movie and have seen it recently, what you'll notice is that the little boy in the show uses the Reese's Candies to lure E.T., right, back to the house. And so this is really one of the first examples of product placement in American media, and it's definitely worth noting because of that. Typically, there's over 3 billion product placements taking place every year in television or film in the American media. And again, this is a type of disguised influencing. It's not the same as subliminal advertising, but it is related, right? Because you're not actually focusing on the product, you're just couching it in the background, but people are seeing the product, and are they aware of the product, or are they just watching the script, and is the product kind of just there in terms of a presence? And what kind of a effect does that product presence have in terms of our eventual perceptions of what products are the best, or what products do these characters use, and I want to use the same products that these characters use because I like those people, or things like that. So there is a disguised influencing element there. Again, there's always the possibility for ethical issues of product placement as well. And I do have a clip that you folks can also watch, which will give you several examples of product placements that have taken place in American film and television shows. So please make some time to watch these, just so you can get more familiar with how frequent and how ubiquitous product placement really is. And again, always going back to that idea of, have I been influenced by product placement without even realizing it, and to what extent and in what potential purchasing decisions have I been influenced, right? It's definitely something that is interesting to think about. Elaboration likelihood model was covered in Chapter 5, and this model addresses the fact that human beings are persuaded by different types of motivations depending on their level of involvement with a given topic. So generally speaking, people who are highly involved in a given issue, and involvement of course deals with how central the issue is to your life, how important that issue is to you, how likely it is that this is something that you know a lot about already, right? People who are highly involved in an issue or a topic will tend to process information in a more central manner. Central processing takes place based on the strength of arguments, logic, and scientific proof or evidence. On the other hand, people who are not highly involved or have low involvement tend to process things in a peripheral way. Low involvement is a situation where somebody does not have much experience with an issue, the issue is not very important to them, and they don't know much about the issue prior to being exposed to the ad. People who have low involvement tend to be persuaded more based on peripheral cues, which include things like celebrity appeals or endorsements, music, colors, different types of aesthetic appeals that they find pleasing or desirable, right? So these are the different processing types, and we're going to go into detail about how it is that people process based on low and high involvement here coming up. Now, according to our textbook on persuasion, those people who have low involvement tend to be influenced merely by exposure. So according to this thesis, if we are able to simply expose people to the same message about the same product or the same company over and over and over, then that type of exposure will eventually influence their attitudes, beliefs, or behaviors. Generally speaking, what this equates to is the more you see or hear of something or a product or a company, the more you will like that product or company, and the more you will, of course, purchase from them. So we can think back to the more recent McDonald's advertisement campaign, which we saw playing out over lots of different types of ads, but it was a musical campaign, right? And it went do 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 do, I'm loving it, right? Okay, so that ad was something that was a consistent musical tone. Okay, we knew when we heard the do 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 do, right? We already know that it's a McDonald's ad that's coming up, right? But what they did is they took that similar theme, that peripheral musical cue, and they applied it to lots of different types of advertisement stories, right? You had people with their kids, you had people with their friends, you had people meeting dates at McDonald's, right? So does this work? Does mere exposure actually cause people to actually purchase? Well, it does work up until a certain point, all right? However, after a certain amount of exposure, people just basically get sick of hearing the same message, right? So this is what happens when people experience what's been called wear out. This is one of the reasons why big companies such as McDonald's and Coca-Cola oftentimes may switch ad corporations so that they can develop new ad approaches so that people don't get sick of the appeal that is being used in a campaign developed by one advertising company. Okay, so the process of switching advertising companies every 2 or 3 years or every 5 years is something that prevents your consumers from getting, quote, wear out, because typically advertising companies will have different types of persuasive appeals that they use, or they have a different style that they use, right? So this is one of the reasons for switching ad corporations regularly, to prevent wear out from your consumers. Low involvement is oftentimes influenced by different processes, which include the magic of association. So of course, having people link a product with a positive experience or a type of interaction or feel-good scenario where people are able to see the product as a focal point that is really the center of an interaction with people, where the people are having a good feeling or a fun time, or they're feeling successful or patriotic, or they're feeling feelings of romance or falling in love, right? These are different types of associations that companies seek to establish between their products and the human experience. Classical conditioning is the idea of pairing certain ideas or certain images or products with different types of feelings, right? So classical conditioning studies have been done by many people, but there was a study conducted in the post-World War II era which sought to understand how it is that Nazi-type prejudice developed. And Stotts and Stotts in 1958 demonstrated in their research study that individuals actually would acquire negative attitudes towards the word Dutch just because they heard that word paired with other words that had negative connotations, such as ugly or failure or things like that. So in a very similar way, consumer researchers have also established that attitudes towards products may be classically conditioned through association with pleasant images, words, or ideas. Semiotics is the study of symbols and signs, and semiotics helps us to understand how different types of visual objects that don't actually hold meaning in themselves come to represent certain things by the way that they're used in society. So when we think back to, for example, the swastika, prior to Nazi Germany in World War II, the swastika was simply a sign that, was a couple of geometrically crossed, lines, and it really didn't have a lot of substance. However, nowadays, when we see that sign, we know generally that people who are evoking it or using it tend to have agendas that are hate-based, especially if you are purposely evoking that type of a swastika symbol. You can also think of different types of symbols in society that are important to people. So, for example, you can think about the cross. The cross is something that many Judeo-Christians use to symbolize the resurrection and crucifixion and redemption of Jesus through the Christian faith. You can also look at the Star of David, which is a 6-point star that has 2 equilateral triangles which represent Jewish culture in the state of Israel, right? But you can think about other more capitalistic types of symbols as well. So when you think about Coca-Cola or McDonald's or Nike or Apple computer, right? You can look at those ideas or look at those images. Like, let's take the Apple icon, for example. Apple is one of those companies that tends to have a very loyal group of followers. So if you are into Apple computers, you are very loyal about it. You tend to only buy Apple products. And so they've actually done research on consumer behaviors and consumer attitudes. And Apple is a company that has done a very good job branding their consumers. And so when you think about the Apple computer or you think about something like Coca-Cola or McDonald's, you know, you can ask yourself, okay, I'm thinking about this symbol, and what is the feeling or the association or what are the thoughts that come to mind when I think of this symbol, right? So semiotics is definitely an area where low involvement processors tend to be persuaded. But one area also that's really relevant to low involvement is the idea of accessibility. So how accessible are the attitudes in memory that come to the forefront of someone's mind when they see an ad or a symbol or hear a song or something like that, okay? So the research that your book talks about from chapter 2 actually suggests that the more exposure consumers have to advertisements that are able to insert the product or image into their mind, then the more quickly or accessible that product is. And so when they are trying to decide, for example, what type of soda or beer to get or something like that, the more accessible the company is in their product placement, the more likely a low involvement processor will be able to draw that image up, and they will purchase the product for that company. So these are all image issues that deal with low involvement processing, very important to consider. And as with all of these discussions, I'd like you to think about how it is that you think you have been persuaded and what types of products you tend to be persuaded in terms of low involvement processing versus what types of products are you persuaded to buy based on being more highly involved. Now, high involvement deals with people who know a lot about an issue. The issue is important to the consumer. It's an issue that's personally relevant to them. And according to elaboration likelihood model, those consumers who are highly involved in an issue will be more persuaded by strong arguments, right? So according to the research on this, there are 3 ways or reasons why it is that strong arguments persuade people who are highly involved. One of the first reasons is the utilitarian function. The utilitarian function suggests that people will purchase certain types of products in order to gain tangible rewards, right? So for example, if you need to have a car that's big enough to drive your kids around because you have 2 or 3 kids, then you're going to be wanting to look for a vehicle such as a minivan or an SUV that will allow you the space that you need in order to tote your kids around to soccer practice and ballet and all of these things, right? So obviously people use products for more than just functional reasons though, right? We may buy a product in order to fulfill certain types of fantasies or dreams or ambitions, right? But the utilitarian function deals with the way that we are persuaded to buy things based on a perceived benefit that we might receive. And your book talks about an interesting situation where a mother was purchasing a Christmas present for her daughter, and she ended up buying her 14-year-old daughter an MP3 player that was $100 cheaper than the most popular brand that the daughter's peer groups were getting, which was an iPod, right? And so the mom thought that she could get away with getting something that was a little less expensive. So she buys her daughter the the more generic version. And of course, her daughter, goes to school with her generic iPod, and she comes home and she's very displeased with the fact that everybody else got the actual iPod for Christmas. Why didn't I get one? And so in this situation, a utilitarian function may not only be the experience of a tangible benefit based on the product, but also the experience of benefits you might get in terms of relationships because you buy that product, right? So according to your book, the next time there was a gift that was coming up, let's say for the daughter's birthday, 3 months later, the mom went out and bought the iPod because she wanted to experience the benefit, the utilitarian benefit of having her daughter approve of what she bought and having her daughter's, feelings of positive and goodwill towards her because she was able to deliver the product that her daughter really wanted. We can also look at high involvement processors as those people who may purchase products based on a social identity function. So social identity function is the idea that people will consume or purchase certain types of products, cars, jewelry, let's say other big ticket items, in order to enhance their status, their identity, right? And not only enhance, but maybe distinguish them as separate or different or in some ways maybe better than other people, okay? So people tend to buy what they call big ticket items, right? Cars, houses, boats, right? Things like that, in order to establish their status, right? To look like they're cool, or to express love, perhaps, to another person, okay? And so typically when advertisements are appealing to people through the social identity function, they tend to draw from these types of appeals by establishing the need. They use pictures and images and perhaps music or things like that that may promote someone feeling as if they purchase this product, they're able to enhance their identity in some way, and may actually feel more superior than they currently feel, right? So you can think about some of the folks you might know who have these really big trucks, and they're all souped up, and they got they have all of the bells and whistles on the trucks that are these things all really necessary for the functioning of the vehicle? Probably not, but it is something that people buy into, right? Because it makes them feel like they are, in a sense, your vehicle is oftentimes an extension of yourself, right? I'm not sure if you folks feel that way, but when I drive around and I see all the various types of vehicles that people have and the way that they stylize those vehicles, whether you stylize them with special license plates or hubcaps or different types of vanity, paint writing or pictures or, things like that, right? Various things that are not actually necessary for the vehicle to run, but they give the person who's driving it a sense of social identity about this is who I am and I like who I am, right? There was an advertisement that Nissan came out with, your book refers to this, which of course deals with this social identity function. And Nissan actually had a tagline that buying a car from Nissan may promote feelings of superiority, which was actually a tagline for a Nissan car ad. So you can, think about how some of these social identity motivations that the ads are seeking to appeal are very blatant, right? Finally, the high involvement processor is more likely to purchase based on a value expressive function. The value expressive function is something that deals with deep-seated or established values that people have prior to purchasing the product. So you can think about people, for example, who have really strong attitudes about protecting the environment, right? So those people would probably be more likely to be influenced to purchase products that depict themselves as being environmentally friendly, okay? Some people are very against testing on animals, right? So you have products now with shampoos and body lotions and, all sorts, and makeup and all sorts of things where there's a little symbol even at the back of the bottle that has a little bunny rabbit with a line through it, right? Maybe you've seen this, but I myself tend to buy products that do not do animal testing because I love animals and I have a couple of animals at home, and so that's something that I will admit definitely influences me, right? And so advertisers are able to take different types of ideas or code words such as recycling, green, or other types of things like that to try to convince people like myself, or even people that are your parents or my parents' age, baby boomers, Generation Xers, and millennials, which is more your generation, to shop while they drop, while at the same time purchasing products that are so environmentally correct. So it's just a very interesting way that companies are able to target our own motivations and appeals. And in many ways, we don't even realize why it is that we're being convinced to purchase the things that we purchase or to have the attitudes that we have towards certain companies. So I encourage you to think again about your own processing of various types of products and how it is and why it is that you have developed the attitudes and purchasing decisions and behaviors that you have developed. It would be very interesting, I think, just to think back on some of those choices you've made and some of those attitudes you have, and to ask yourself, have I been processing certain products in a low processing way? And if so, what types of ads have influenced me there? And in what ways and in what products have I been processing things with more high involvement? And what kinds of motivations and appeals have worked for me personally in terms of my own purchasing behavior there? Given that the chapter in advertising touches on lots of different ideas and different topics. And given that we are going to be having chapter 11 and chapter 12 being covered in the module for this week, I will not be talking about every single theory in the chapter on advertising, but I do strongly suggest that you read the entire chapter so that you are aware of those ideas in case they show up on an exam. You can also potentially draw from these ideas in the cultivation of your own final projects. And most importantly, it's good for us to read through all of the ideas so that we become more aware and conscious of our own tendency to be persuaded as consumers and purchasers in the capitalist society with which we live. So please do make sure you read the entire chapter, even though I am not talking about every single theory that's talked about in this chapter. So to conclude this lecture, we're going to be talking about ethics in advertising briefly. So one thing that deals with ethics is the acknowledgement that the motivation for the advertising and corporate advertising industry in the USA and globally is a profit motive, right? So clearly, when we look at something from an ethical perspective, we can ask ourselves questions such as, if the motivation to persuade people is based on money or profit, is that really an ethical use of all of these pieces of information and theories and knowledge that these corporations have about what will make us buy their products, right? So this is a question that is not easy to answer. There are various viewpoints about ethics and whether advertising is really ethical. What I'm going to say is that we live in a capitalist society. Advertising and the power of the mass media is undisputed in terms of the effect that it has on people's ideas, impressions, motivations, and purchasing products, obviously. However, the most important aspect of ethics, I think, in advertising is our own involvement in that system. And what I mean by that is that if we are going to look at how we are being persuaded or whether our children are being persuaded in ways that we don't want them to be persuaded, then that's something that we are able to influence ourselves, right? And so when we look at issues related to ethics in advertising, regardless of where we stand on that issue, the idea of media literacy becomes very important in a discussion on ethics and on competence and on conscious decision making. So media literacy is a term that's gained more and more recognition and attention recently, and it's oftentimes researched by communication media scholars. And media literacy is basically the idea that we are able to teach ourselves and also our children and other people that we might be able to influence about the powerful effect that media can have in our ideas, in terms of our desires, in terms of what we're persuaded to do or not to do, and obviously our purchasing decisions as well. So those of us who have media literacy have been able to look behind the scenes. We've sought out information which helps us to understand what motivates these for-profit companies to appeal to us in the ways that they do. And of course, media literacy is all about teaching ourselves and our children that the media is not exactly what it looks like, right? That advertisements are not all that they may be seeming to be, that film and television shows are fiction, that violence on television is something that is used to promote consumer viewing, that it is not something that necessarily is taking place with the frequency and regularity with which we see it, that sexual behavior on the television or in advertisements is not necessarily something that we should seek to emulate, but rather we should seek to understand what motivation the advertisement is attempting to use to appeal to us in terms of shaping our attitudes, beliefs, or behaviors. So if you want to Google the term media literacy, you can go ahead and do that. It'll give you a more in-depth review of what that is and how it is that you can cultivate your own sense of media literacy. But in any kind of discussion on advertising or the role of mass media in society, I find that the term and the idea and the process of media literacy is extremely important in bringing the awareness about, in all of us, that the media is driven by profit, and that we simply cannot just watch what we see on TV or in film or in ads and just assume that that is how we should behave. Again, the advertising industry is banking on the fact that they can use the intangible to shape consumer purchasing decisions. And so because of this, we often see that there is an access to the intangible that is exaggerated or played up, or perhaps it's idealized, our ability to actually achieve something because we simply purchase a product. And of course, another ethical issue is the perceived need that is constantly being created or engendered in us when we consume advertisements, right? So advertisements have to create a perception of need, otherwise it won't be effective. And is that constant bombardment of images and ideas and lifestyles and products into our daily interaction something that is really ethical for a modern society that we seek to establish with harmony and peace, right? So when we look at like highly sexualized images in the advertising industry of, women, for example, mostly women, right? Or we look at the way that alcohol is advertised as something that, only creates positive experiences for people, and yet the negative experiences are really not presented at all, hardly ever. At the most, you might see an advertisement about alcohol, have a little line at the bottom that says, please drink responsibly, or please get a designated driver, right? So, are these ads effective in terms of an ethical society? And this is one of the reasons why media literacy is so central and so important in our modern society that is really dominated by the media. So we can look at things that are advertised, such as cigarettes. We do see cigarettes advertised less now on television, right? The Federal Communications Commission and other types of ethics groups have influenced that. But when I was growing up, there were many cigarette ads on television. And we also, nowadays, there's still a lot of alcohol ads. We see people advertising different cars or automobiles. There's advertisements for clothes, for food, for different types of things that promote sexual lifestyles, right? Like Trojan condoms, for example. Obviously, they're going to use sex as a type of an appeal in an ad. But you also see ads about things that are, a little less questionable. So clearly, an advertisement that's promoting a car or clothing or a certain type of a phone or even body spray, right? Like Axe body spray. If someone buys, for example, a nice car, or if they buy Axe body spray, are they really going to have women that are coming up to them and just can't wait to get in their car and go on a date or do more with them? No, they're not, right? But that's the intangible that is being promised through this product, right? And so this is one of the reasons why, we question these issues and we want to consider these issues, especially in terms of the way that they impact us personally and, of course, the people that we love and care about who may need to be talked with about the impact of advertising in the media in a modern society. So one ethics issue that I think that all of us can probably agree on that we're not quite sure if it's ethical is this idea of marketing to children, okay? And so for those of us who are 18 years old and above, or in the case of alcohol, 21 and above, we see ads for alcohol. We see ads that use highly sexualized images to try to sell cars or clothing or cell phones or body spray or whatever, right? But we are adults, and we like to think as adults that we are conscious enough to make effective and responsible purchasing decisions based on our own mind and our own conclusions, right? And hopefully in a class like this, we're becoming even more aware of the ways that we ourselves are being targeted to do the things that we do in terms of purchasing, right? But I think one issue that is fairly common in terms of a discussion of ethics is this idea of our children and how our children are being shaped by the advertising industry. More specifically, in the chapter on advertising, there is a section that is reviewed that was actually put forth by Coca-Cola. And in that section, there are a list of ways that you can effectively sell your product. And one of the things that they talk about on this list, by the way, this is on page 307, it's in a box called Selling God, Country, and Coke. And on number 6, it says, get them young. Obviously, if you can achieve loyalty among youthful customers, you're possibly fostered lifetime consumption, okay? Now, Coca-Cola, do we care so much about Coca-Cola marketing to our children? Well, okay, potentially. You have the issue of childhood obesity, which is a growing concern and a growing epidemic in the USA and globally. So there's that ethical issue. But I think more importantly, for a discussion on marketing to kids, we're looking at things like Joe the Camel, which, Joe Camel used to have a lot of advertisements on television, not so much anymore, but on these ads you would see almost a cartoon version of Joe Camel, right? And more recently, on some Super Bowl advertisements, and you can even Google this commercial if you forgot what it looks like, but the Budweiser frog. And this was a very popular commercial, and it drew a lot of criticism from media ethics groups who were wondering, why is it that this advertisement is using images that would appeal to children, such as cartoon-ish frogs that are, jumping, going, Budweiser, Budweiser. And if you haven't seen this ad, I encourage you to Google it so you can get a sense of how appealing the visuals and the music and the whole scene is. And it almost plays like a cartoon, right? So is it ethical, for example, if we see an ad that appears to be designed for a younger audience and to appeal to a younger audience in terms of the visual aesthetics and the music and the characters of the frogs and things like that, is it ethical, really, that Budweiser is marketing to children before they are even of age to consider having a drink? And if so, what are the possible effects of this? Okay, do we want our children talking about alcohol commercials at school after they see it because it's so appealing that they're like, oh, remember the frog? And oh, yeah, I really like the frog. And, and of course, get them young, right? That's one thing that marketers are banking on. One other thing that I think that we can discuss, and this was also a topic in one of the several PSAs that I posted in the module for this week, is the marketing of junk food to children, okay? So you can think back to when you were growing up and watching Saturday morning cartoons or any kind of after-school programming, and, there is just an incessant amount of food advertisements that appeal to children, right? And you look at cartoons and, so like Frosted Lucky Charms are magically delicious. Why do I still know that? Even though I haven't been a child for 30 years, right? I know that, and that is branded in my brain because much like you, I also grew up watching the Frosted Lucky Charms cereal ad over and over and over, right? And I always wanted my parents to buy me that cereal because they had the little marshmallows in it, right? Now, my parents, of course, never bought us that cereal, but I still thought it was the best cereal, would have loved to have gone to one of my friends' houses and had a bowl of that Frosted Lucky Charms, right? Now, given that we're living in an era where childhood obesity has reached an all-time high, we have type 2 diabetes among children as well, and a lot of these issues are based on the fact that kids are eating more and more processed food that, of course, is not fresh and healthy like we are supposed to be eating, right? We are supposed to, in order to be healthy individuals, we need to be eating healthy, fresh food that does not contain preservatives or high amounts of sugar, or salt or all of these things, right? But these advertising companies clearly are just marketing for profit. And so, what are the ethical issues with regards to marketing to our kids? What kind of a role do we have to play in not only educating our children about these ads, but also in making, responsible purchasing choices? And is there a role that the public needs to play in terms of keeping the advertising industry accountable for marketing products that are unhealthy to young children, right? So these are all things to think about. And obviously there are lots of consumer media groups that address these kinds of issues. You can certainly Google this idea if you want to get more involved in that. But suffice to say that this idea of media literacy in terms of our own purchasing and our own persuasion is so important. And of course, media literacy and teaching our kids about the fact that the media is driven by profit and that the cereals that they see on Saturday morning cartoon advertisements are very unhealthy and things like that. This is something that we ourselves can influence in our own lives personally, right? So at the very least, even if our advertising industry continues to market cigarettes and beer and unhealthy junk food to our children, we do have the power to influence the way in which our kids view the media by talking with them about the reality of the media system and the reality of alcohol and cigarettes and, of course, junk food, among other things. Hopefully, this lecture has been informative, and Hopefully we've all learned a little bit more about advertising and, of course, what motivates our own purchasing decisions. I encourage you to think about yourself and what are some things that you found surprising or interesting in terms of the way that you possibly have been influenced. And hopefully this chapter has provided more information so that we can understand the advertising industry more, so that we ourselves can make more informed decisions as consumers. Thank you for your time, and I'll talk to everyone in the next chapter.